I believe by the year 2040, we'll be looking at options such as artificial wombs.
It raises all sorts of, so many moral and sort of practical and logistical and legal kind of questions.
For sure.
Is it a topic that people don't want to talk about? Like, is there something kind of strange about the decline of fertility rates, which makes it a bit of a taboo?
I think there's a lot of myths surrounding the decline of fertility.
So we sort of kick off, as I always do, with your kind of wildest prediction for the future.
Yeah, so my wildest prediction is around the way in which we will carry babies in the future. So I believe by the year 2040, we'll be looking at options such as artificial wombs, so growing babies and children outside of the human body.
2040, that seems very soon.
It does indeed, but as all futurists, it's not just picking out wild predictions from the air. You know, we're already looking at the technology available to facilitate this. So if you think about it more as a closing of the gap, at the moment, we're of course able to freeze eggs and zygotes and place them in a human body. And we're able to keep babies alive from kind of a 23, 24 week mark. So it's just working across the next 6 years to close that gap, to be able to keep babies alive for the entire gestation period.
I'm extremely ignorant when it comes to all of this stuff, actually. What's the sort of hardest part of that process? Like, what are the sort of big technological leaps that need to happen to get us there?
Yeah, I mean, there's the technological leaps, of course, but there's also the investment leaps. I would say that's, we can do anything fast. And I think the likes of Elon Musk prove that, right? Wherever we can put our money, we can make things happen very quickly. So it's really not about kind of the technology. It's about overcoming the money investment. It's about overcoming the kind of social aspect around that. So it's not so much the technology that we really need to work on, but the desire to do so. So I think the growth in women's wealth is really going to be a big part of that. The way in which we look at health tech, the way in which we look at AI, this is something that potentially, we could do quicker than that, but it's really about getting that investment force behind it. And like I said, there are already scientists out there today really on the cusp of being able to facilitate this technology and facilitate the survival and growth of these prematurely born fetuses from 23 to 34 weeks gestation onwards. So it's about really putting the money behind the technology to close that gap.
What would happen in an artificial womb? Like, what kind of nutrients need to be given? What kind of conditions need to be created to make sure that a fetus can develop in a sort of artificial environment like that?
Yeah, so it's really about understanding, like you said, all the different parts at play here, understanding the nutrients, understanding the microbiome. There's a lot that we don't already understand at the moment about vaginal microbiome, not only kind of what nutrients are needed, but the relationship there between the mother's microbiome and the baby microbiome. But we're seeing already a lot of development in the last year in that space, in understanding that relationship. And that will be, I think that nutrient element is the key question going forward in the next 4 years. Not just keeping the lights on, so to speak, in the artificial womb, but facilitating the relationship between the womb and the baby.
And how do you see this playing out? Like, is it going to be that ever more premature babies get put in this situation and then that sort of timeline changes? Or is it going to be that women that are carrying particularly difficult in particularly difficult circumstances will choose this as an option instead up front? Like, what does this kind of roadmap look like?
Yeah, again, it comes down to money. So I think where we're going to see this implemented first is within the super, super rich, right? I mean, if you look to the likes of Paris Hilton at the moment and the way in which she's being able to have children in her early 40s through surrogacy, at the moment, that is the preferred option for the ultra wealthy. But I think as we start seeing these conversations, and I think love or hate the Kardashians, they have really kind of brought this topic to the fore in the way in which they talk about the relationship with their surrogate children. So Khloe Kardashian in the last year has spoken about how her relationship with a baby carried by surrogate was very different to the relationship she had with the baby she carried herself. So if you start thinking of the emotional implications of a surrogate, you start thinking of the trust implications, you start thinking of this kind of, helicopter intensive parenting parenting that is developed, soon you won't want to put your trust, or the ultra wealthy won't want to put their trust in another human being. They'll feel much more like they can trust a machine and have control over how that baby develops in a way that doesn't involve a third party. So I think that's where we're really going to start seeing this from an emotional and technological and societal lens come together. And then, of course, there are the implications of politics. So as we look at Roe versus Wade in the US, at the moment, a surrogate still has some rights around being able to abort or not abort a baby. That, for the parents, is obviously quite sensitive. And while at the moment that kind of lies in the region of there being complications within the pregnancy, of course, if you want to eliminate any external control, technology would appear to be the solution forward.
It raises all sorts of, well, so many moral and sort of practical and logistical and legal kind of questions.
For sure.
To the point where, I don't know, it almost seems like it's a bit of a slippery slope, I guess, because generally speaking, these things start off incredibly expensive and used in extraordinary situations. Mm-hmm. And then as time goes on and economies of scale kind of work out, it becomes an opportunity for more and more people. And then it becomes a kind of like an everyday choice that people can make, to the extent where, it almost becomes quite a commonplace.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you see that a bit with cesarean sections, where they've almost become a lifestyle choice rather than a kind of medical necessity.
Yeah, well, I would argue the opposite. I think a lot of women now are being forced down the route of cesareans because of the health crisis, because doctors are able to plan in cesareans. And so what started as a lifestyle choice now is being overused by the medical system. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That dynamic has the same implications when we think about artificial wombs.
And if that happens, are we getting to a better place or a different place or a worse place?
Yeah, of course, as a futurist yourself, we try not to place our own bias on these things. But if we think about the two ends of the spectrum here, of course, there is implications here of, these children growing up that have been artificially born. We mentioned the microbiome there, how that might be different for them, but also looking at kind of how we react in society differently, perhaps, to a artificially born child, to a human grown child. I guess there's also kind of implications there on power and dynamics and, the way in which we choose certain features, the same kind of issues that we have already with IVF that people are very reactive towards. But for me, I look at the kind of the implications on women in society, the differences that might make in terms of when and how you are able to kind of have children might be a huge opportunity for women who want to have children later in life. And this is something that could really help women in terms of wanting that power over how and when they have children and the implications on their career. So we know, women are typically leaving the workplace for kind of anywhere between 6 weeks and a year when they have children. They have issues while they are pregnant. That means they are not able to work potentially in the same way. So if you can overcome all of those issues, it definitely has an impact on women in the workplace, women's wealth, and the gender pay and gender wealth and health gaps. So yeah, it's a lot to consider.
One would hope it has the ability to have a profound impact on the way that women, especially of a certain sort of age band, thought about in the workplace. It's always hard to know the degree to which it's used as an excuse to justify things which are absolutely unfair, or whether there is a sense of practicality and commercialism about those decisions. But this seems like an excellent way to completely change the nature of those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to be wary of technology in the wrong hands, of course. I think we see the conversation about freezing eggs and egg retrieval at the moment, the likes of Google, who are, promoting schemes for women in the workplace to be able to freeze their eggs. And, it's very split. There are people who think that's absolutely incredible. It's giving an opportunity to women. And then there's the cynicism. Why do Google want women to freeze their eggs? Do they then stay in the workplace for longer? It drives longer loyalty. There's no question that there is a benefit to businesses as well in doing this. And I think it'll be having the same conversations around different kinds of technology. So I should also mention the ability to postpone menopause. So ovarian rejuvenation is also a key part of this conversation. And it's complex. It's more than we can unpack, I'm sure, in a short conversation, but hopefully some of the themes we've got here are opening questions for people that we'll need to ask as we go forward.
The motivations is a very interesting question. Mm-hmm. And one can definitely take the cynical view to a company like Google allowing women to essentially put off having kids, and the same with the sort of menopause discussion. What's your sense of the environment at the moment and where the money is coming from to allow this happen? Like, is this being driven by sort of women entrepreneurs? Is it hard for these companies to raise money? What's the sort of dynamic at the moment?
So there was an absolutely amazing boom in FemTech in 2021, 2022. Unfortunately, we're seeing that slow down in the same way we're seeing the rest of the health tech sector slightly slow down. Unfortunately, there haven't been the big exits that were promised. We're finding that the investment that was given was just not enough to take to these companies the places that they promised that they would take for investors. There's also the fact that investment in female founders has retracted. So we were at 2% in 2021. We're now more around the 1% mark. So that's 1% of all funding available going to female founders. And in terms of kind of FemTech and healthtech, it does not have to be female founders, but the likelihood is that it is more likely that women closer to the needs of those around them identify these opportunities. So it's not a super positive place to be at the moment in terms of investment, in terms of kind of the VC world. In terms of business world, I think we're seeing a lot more partnerships. So I've been lucky enough to work on some recent work around for a big FMCG company who really wanted to uncover the future of human capital and understanding the future of talent and how to attract talent and how to retain talent. And through that, a huge conversation was around the gender gap within their workplace and how they retain women. So they are genuinely looking at this, like, how do we change the gender gap by working with third parties who can kind of facilitate some of these benefits within the workplace. But if those kind of parties don't exist because they haven't been able to get the funding and investment outside for the seed funding rounds, it's not quite where it needs to be. So it's a tricky time, but of course I'm hopeful. I have to be hopeful. I wouldn't be doing this job otherwise. And there is a lot of innovation that, will develop and should develop over the next 5 years.
Are there any sort of like good explanations or justifications for the difficulty that female founders have in raising money? I mean, is there anything that we can take from it that might make us feel like it's more logical or rational and fair than the numbers suggest?
It's certainly logical. If you have a history of a very heavily male industry, so the investment industry is very heavily male, there isn't the desire there to invest in things that seem foreign or risky. So in terms of an investor, a male investor, if someone's coming to them and they say, we've solved a problem, and the investor has that problem, has heard of that problem, or can identify with that problem, of course, they're going to be more likely to invest. If you're coming to the table with a super niche or, a problem that you haven't heard a lot about because there's not a lot of awareness around women's health problems, and that's due to women not speaking up, it's due to doctors perpetuating medical misogyny. It's a problem that we all perpetuate. But if that investor then isn't familiar with the problem, of course, they're not going to be so eager and willing to invest. So the work in which I do, I'm really passionate about working with investors, whether that's male investors, female investors, to help understand where the investment should go that's really going to drive a return on investment. Because there's also a lot of investment out there that's just, people popping up with random menopause supplements that can't do what it says on the tin. And so investors are getting nervous. It's a crowded market, menopause, at the moment. they don't want to just throw their money at anything. They want to make sure they're throwing their money at something sticks. So I see myself as an interpreter between the investment industry and the startup industry to make sure the investment and money goes where it needs to go.
It always seems, I think this is a lack of imagination on my behalf, but I can never really understand quite how limited the imagination is of people in VC, where the degree to which they place investments seem to be on people that are quite like them, whether that's, as defined by race or class or gender, and people who are solving problems that they themselves have. Yeah. And therefore you end up with apps to get laid. You end up with replacements for mum, who can deliver you food. And they all seem to be solving the kind of problems that the sort of tech elite have. And that's somewhat understandable, but it seems incredibly hard to justify. Because even if you take the approach that you're going to be ultra capitalist about this, like the vast majority of opportunities that are out there are helping people that are somewhat normal. And that includes the 49.6% of people on the planet that are women. So you don't have to kind of come to this with an altruistic sense to realize there's just tons of money to be made in making good products and services that have real value and solve problems that normal people have.
Yeah, absolutely. And the pharmaceutical... Sorry, I interrupted.
No, but somehow that doesn't seem to get through.
No, and I think it takes time, right? I think the pharmaceutical industry are waking up to that now. And through the work I do, I don't just work with startups. I work with a lot of kind of big pharma companies. And it's truly that they just want to see the evidence and the return on investment before making that leap. And as I said, that's my job, right? To help them understand and see the white spaces. I'm not sure it's wildly different from any other industry. It's just there isn't the research, the data, and the awareness behind it. And that takes time, takes more time than perhaps, in other parts of my job where I'm helping people develop psychedelic tomato ketchup. We already see the evidence there in psychedelics. We know that they already have a booming business in tomato ketchup. It's not such a leap to marry the two together, whereas perhaps foraying into the world of women's health, where there is a lot of social and political noise, shall we say, around it, feels more risky and more dangerous for them. And perhaps a higher risk of being cancelled.
Yeah. I mean, it's extraordinary because there seems to be so much money being spent on longevity. And so much research into helping us live longer lives. Like one of the trends that people don't seem to talk about that much is the decline of fertility rates and the degree to which families or women are putting off having kids until much later and then finding out it's not as easy as they thought. And a lot of people, I think, spend most of their life paranoid that they're going to have an unwanted pregnancy. And then they don't realize quite how hard it is to conceive naturally by the end. Is it a topic that people don't want to talk about? Like, is there something kind of strange about the decline of fertility rates, which makes it a bit of a taboo? I don't really understand it.
I think there's a lot of myths surrounding the decline of fertility. From the research I've seen, the headlines that you see is that women are delaying having babies because of their careers. From the research I've seen, that's actually not true. It is men who are making the decision to delay having babies because they want to accrue more wealth or they're not ready yet. And they have more of a choice to do so, perhaps, than women. So yeah, there's a huge amount to unpack. And I think also when we're talking about fertility, the biggest switch that we need to see happen that is not a women's issue. It is for men and women to unpack together. And I think that's also difficult. But yeah, I think there's a lot to be unpacked in terms of society and politics that surround that question that we don't always do so.
I mean, is it a huge problem in your eyes? I mean, if people are waiting later in life to have a degree of financial security to ensure that they can have a kid and be as stable as they need to, is there something there that is okay, or is this a kind of huge problem for the future generally?
I mean, if you think of it super rationally, I mean, if we come from the climate change argument, we're already overpopulated. Do we need to have more children? That's not my personal view, but it's the view of some people, right?
Yeah.
I think, there's the argument of is it inherently selfish to have children? You know, why do people think, you know, is there something good about leaving a little bit later and people have one and they raise that child differently to perhaps raising five? I mean, there's a big shift in kind of why we have these children these days. If you look kind of 50, 100 years ago, people had children at certain levels in society because they needed to have people to look after them in older age. They needed them to bring an income. We don't have those same needs today. So when you think about the change in fertility rates, you automatically emotionally say, is that women who can't have children anymore? But there's a lot more complicated than that. I think we also need to kind of look at it from a global perspective, right? I think it's really interesting to see that in the likes of China, where they reversed their one-child policy, the impact that had, it hasn't necessarily resulted in a huge boom of these large families because people are in a different mindset. You know, women have a different role in the home. They don't necessarily have kind of such a focus on family versus kind of career. You know, things are shifting and changing. So it's a deeply complex conversation. And it's one, again, that I'm lucky to be unpacking at the moment. I'm working on a project that is the future of contraception. And initially it was like, okay, what's all the tech that's changing here to enable contraception in different ways? But it soon became a project around how are relationships changing? How is politics influencing the way people feel about contraception? Like you said, you know, if we look at Roe versus Wade, people are taking contraception much more seriously because they know they could be criminalized should they choose to have an abortion. So there's a lot at play when it comes to that fertility rate and why it's in decline. And it changes drastically from country to country, particularly when you're looking at, I think the biggest differences are US, China, and Africa.
So we've talked quite a lot about artificial wombs. You sort of touched upon the idea of kind of delaying menopause with, was it called ovarian rejuvenation? Is that right?
Yeah. So if you think of longevity, it's kind of part of the longevity conversation with ovaries being the fastest aging organ in the body.
And how does that process work?
I mean, I am not a scientist. We'll get a scientist on the next one. But effectively, it's slowing down the aging. So it's looking at things like, so I don't know if you're familiar with glycan-age. The way in which, so that's Tim Spector's latest Silicon Valley investment, looking at, different parts of your body that are aging in terms of kind of collagen. So you can put a stamp on your biological age. So it's looking at kind of the way in which kind of hormones break down. It's looking at kind of injections that you can give to slow down that aging process. And in terms of ovarian aging, looking at how you can do that specifically for the ovaries.
And are there any other kind of themes that you're looking at as part of your agency and the future of women in regards to sort of health and technology?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we're talking pretty far out here. You know, we're talking about kind of getting to artificial wombs. We're talking about ovarian aging, but much nearer in, I'm so excited about the way in which women are biohacking. So biohacking is, of course, a term that's been around for tens of thousands of years, whether, you know, we ate specific diets back in caveman days to be stronger and fitter. But the way in which women are able now to optimize this through technology is super exciting. So anything from an Aura ring, which gives different biometrics to perhaps your Apple Watch. So I use it to track my basal body temperature, which gives me an indication of where I'm at in my cycle. So I'm able to eat differently, different weeks of my cycle, train differently. Say train very loosely. I'm not an athlete, but of course there are athletes out there using this in a very serious way that we weren't able to before. And I've just seen actually on one of the startups I'm on a new app, which now promises to help you understand your cycle through productivity for the workplace. So understanding when do you have those amazing peaks? Because we so often talk about the negative side of hormones for women, right? You know, the weeks where you're kind of struggling, you're out of work, you're sluggish, but there's also this amazing part of your cycle where you're super productive and creative and full of ideas. So yeah, being able to use technology to really hack the system in every possible way. That's truly what I'm excited about today.
I'm fascinated by how how sort of widespread these conversations are. Like I'm really aware, as a bit of a kind of futurist type of person, you might get a sort of smell of something or sort of hear something from someone, and then you start Googling it a little bit, or following a few people on the topic. And then before you know where you are, it appears that everyone in the world is talking about this. And
for sure,
it's quite easy to think these things are quite a big thing. But I have a real sense that certainly in the UK, I think there's a company called Zoe that's looking at sort of gut health. I was exploring the other day on Apple Health on my phone, and the number of data feeds that it had coming into it. I've bought a kind of Whoop band, and it's quite easy to sort of see the resolution of information that you can have access to. And it's quite easy to see how the whole kind of quantified self movement that people talked about 10 years is actually really starting to become quite high definition. But I always wonder sort of how unusual people who are doing this sort of thing are.
And again, I'm in a bubble, right? I live and breathe this stuff all day. So I have to kind of challenge myself every now and again to try and get out of that bubble and speak to quote unquote real people. And I find it really, I think Zoe is a really great example of how biohacking has very quickly become mainstream. I think though, you see this curve, people now starting to question it a little bit. It's this amazing technology, but actually it's only one biomarker. And as we start to see this kind of fragmentation of that industry is where it's going to get really, and you use the word high definition there. So as we start to see these more mainstream technologies then used in different ways for different people, I think that's where things are going to get exciting. And I know I'm asked by my, fairly mainstream clients, where should we join the conversation? We're kind of on this health conversation. We know wearables and quantified health is happening. How do we join that conversation? And what's the right moment in time to start going off into women's health, or perhaps addressing something more specific like diabetes or different conditions or longevity? And I tend to kind of put that around the kind of 3 to 5 year mark at the moment, where we'll really start seeing the likes of Cadbury popping up with menopause chocolate or fertility chocolate. But it's coming for sure. It's on that curve that we know so well as futurists, but we're definitely in the early adopter stage.
I find it fascinating that kind of that the blurry line between kind of pharmaceutical products, surgical products, wellness, beauty, fitness, and you get everything from kind of Botox, which is kind of surgery, kind of pharmaceutical, kind of wellness. You get sort of Ozempic, which is becoming a sort of lifestyle choice. You get things like human growth hormone. In America, some sort of doctors are pushing blood platelet therapy. A friend of mine is flying to the Bahamas today to do stem cell therapy. And you get to a point where you think, I know we're in this very sort of interesting sort of early stages, I think, of having access to all of this information. And you wonder how much of it will just be proven to be unknowable or unhelpful.
For sure. We're still in that deep experimentation phase, right? And that's where I'm like slightly cynical around the likes of Zoe. Like I said, it's one biomarker, and it's great because that simplicity really cuts through for consumers right now. But as education builds, those apps will also have to evolve. And what I'm excited about with some of the startups I work at, they say, we're right at the forefront. We are the future of this. But you're like, but things are keep moving. You might be the future because the consumer doesn't know more right now, but you've got to keep evolving in order to continue to being at the future and the frontier of this future that you're seeing unfold.
No, that's fascinating. I think I want to ask you just one sort of final thought to leave with. So I don't know, are you hopeful for the future?
Oh, depends on the day. Depends on my hormones is probably the answer there. If I'm feeling not hopeful, I check my app and I'm like, oh, that's the PMS coming in. I am hopeful because I feel like I am part of the change and I'm driving the change. I think when I was slightly more kind of on the side of this world and I wasn't able to have those conversations with big companies and investors every day, I felt quite hopeless about where things are headed. As long as for me, I feel like I'm part of the change, that makes me feel hopeful, probably in a slightly egotistical way, but that's what I need to do every day to stay hopeful for what's coming.
I love it. Rhiannon Jones, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Bye.